Jiho was deeply perplexed after hearing this. In order to please her husband and his daughter, Lan and I personally prepared meals and cakes at home for her daughter, in order to take care of the family. Lan and I even neglected her own biological son. Tom said he was hungry and wanted to eat, but she told him to hold on. Soon Lan and I prepared a big table of dishes. However, her husband and daughter did not come home for a long time. She sent a text message to her husband, but did not receive any response. It turned out that her husband had taken the child to meet his ex-wife. The four of them were already happily celebrating her daughter's birthday. At this moment, Lan and I noticed that there was a kind of seasoning missing in the house. On her way to the supermarket, she saw her husband's car. Then Lan and I saw a scene that made her extremely sad. Seeing her husband and his ex-wife happily together, Lan and I felt a sense of utter despair. Her repeated forbearance had only brought her countless cruel tortures. Unexpectedly, this scene was seen by her father, who happened to be passing by. She asked Lan and I what those people were doing. When she learned that it was her husband's daughter's birthday, her father immediately wanted to go and ask. Lan and I, however, begged him not to. Her father scolded Lan and I for being so useless, and why she kept putting up with it. Watching her father's sad back as he left, Lan and I could no longer control the grievances in her heart. After returning home, her mind was filled with the words her father had used to educate her. Lan and I couldn't bear to let her father worry about her anymore, so her husband finally returned home with his daughter, lying that the kindergarten party had gone on too long, and after that, he didn't forget to ask Lan and I's son to come over for dinner. But Tom said he had just eaten some of his sister's cake crumbs. Perhaps Jiho felt bad in her heart. He got up and embraced his wife, saying he wanted to take her on a trip. But his father couldn't calm down his grievances. After getting drunk, he vented his dissatisfaction with his wife, saying that she had no idea how her daughter was really living. But his mother thought that father was just being drunk and crazy at home. The next day, father asked Lan and I out alone, and questioned her about how she was going to handle her husband. Lan and I had her own difficulties in her heart, because the two daughters in the family were still young. To them she was just a stepmother who had just entered the family. Moreover, she also had a son. Lan and I is afraid that she will cause Tom harm, and thinks that she is the only one who should tolerate it, so that her husband will not be embarrassed and maybe even love Tom. But her father still advises Lan and I not to just tolerate, because that will only make her and her grandson more passive at home. Lan and I asks her father not to tell her mother about this, and admits that she will definitely deal with this matter this time. However, her uninformed mother finds her daughter the next day, because her younger sister had found a husband and might get married soon, and she wanted to borrow some money from Jiho for the dowry. Lan and I felt at a loss for words, and had to lie that she would ask her husband for the money after her sister had set a wedding date. Then Lan and I took out an envelope and gave it to her mother, and said that it was a gift from her son-in-law to the two elderly people. The next day Jiho took the whole family on a trip. At this time everyone's face was filled with a very happy smile, but the story was always so unsatisfactory. Jiho's ex-wife called him again. It turned out that his ex-wife had appendicitis, and called her family but got no answer. She had no choice but to call her ex-husband again. Jiho saw his wife and children happily together, and finally chose to hang up on his ex-wife. That night, Jiho took the opportunity to discuss with his daughters settling Tom down at home. However, the eldest daughter strongly opposed accepting Tom, and threatened her father that she would leave home with her younger sister. The father and daughter had a big fight as a result. However, in the night, the eldest daughter secretly woke up her sleeping younger sister, and then ran directly to the police station with her. The two then called their grandmother to inform her. Jiho soon received a phone call from the police station. After Lan and I learned about it, she sent a text message to her father, asking him to go to the police station and bring Tom back home first. Unexpectedly, her father fell asleep and her mother saw the text message. When Lan and I and her husband arrived at the police station, the ex-mother-in-law also arrived at the police station. She directly accused Lan and I of not taking care of her granddaughter, and even forcing the young child to go to the police station. Just as the woman kept on condemning Lan and I's mother also arrived at the police station, and saw her daughter enduring the abuse from others. The mother also went up to defend her daughter without any hesitation, and questioned why the woman was yelling at her daughter. The woman said that her daughter deserved to be scolded, because ever since Lan and I had married into the family, there had been nothing but trouble. Lan and I's mother saw that the woman was being unreasonable, and so she started to fight back. But in the end, with the police officer's persuasion, the two of them finally stopped. At this point, Lan and I's mother finally understood how much her daughter had suffered after her second marriage. She deeply regretted not listening to her husband's advice at home, and instead, she had been greedy and kept exploiting her poor daughter. When she thought about this, Lan and I's mother's tears could not stop flowing. The next day, she found Lan and I, and said, "If you can't stand the injustice, then get a divorce. Your father and I will always be your strongest backing." But Lan and I said she would definitely persevere. She firmly believed that her hard work would be rewarded. Meanwhile, the ex-wife also learned from her mother's lips that Jiho had agreed to register Lan and I's son. She didn't want Tom to share her daughter's wealth, so she decided to go to Jiho to get an explanation. Meanwhile, Lan and I had also dressed up nicely and was preparing to visit her husband. Unexpectedly, the ex-wife called Jiho away first. Lan and I called to ask where her husband was when she saw that he was not there. Unexpectedly, Jiho lied and said that he was at the office. Facing her husband's deception, Lan and I felt very sad. She guessed that her husband must have reunited with his ex-wife at this time. The ex-wife warned Jiho not to agree to register Lan and I's son, because no one should take her daughter's things. When Jiho returned home, Lan and I didn't want to sit around and do nothing. She once again brought up the issue of registering her son with her husband. Jiho pretended to agree as usual. Lan and I didn't dare say anything more as she saw that her husband was in a bad mood. However, in the night, her youngest daughter, who was staying at her grandmother's house, suddenly had a stomachache. Jiho hurriedly took her daughter to the hospital after learning about it. Lan and I couldn't rest assured and hurried over afterwards. However, she happened to see her husband with his ex-wife. Lan and I could only return home alone and dejected. The next day, it rained heavily outside. Jiho's ex-wife and her best friend were stuck in the suburbs while out for a stroll. When the eldest daughter learned that her mother was stranded, she implored her father to go and save her. Meanwhile, Jiho's ex-mother-in-law also called to say that she couldn't get in touch with her daughter, and hoped that Jiho could go to the suburbs to check on her. Seeing his frightened daughter, Jiho finally decided to go to the suburbs himself to look for his ex-wife. Lan and I was worried that her husband was in danger, and said that they could seek help from the police, but her eldest daughter scolds Lan and I for meddling. Who's going to take responsibility if something happens to her mother? In the end, Jiho ignores Lan and I's objections and leaves the house. Even though Lan and I braves the rain to warn her husband of the danger and dissuade him from going, Jiho doesn't hesitate and accelerates out of the driveway. Lan and I is left alone in the pouring rain, crying in despair. However, when Jiho arrives in a panic in the suburbs, she finds that her ex-wife and her girlfriends have cheerfully boarded a taxi. Then, exhausted both physically and mentally, Jiho did not choose to go home, but instead went directly to the office and stayed overnight. But Lan and I, who was worried about her husband at home, waited all night without closing her eyes. The next day, Lan and I thought long and hard before finally deciding that she could not go on like this, so she mustered her courage and called her husband's ex-wife. After the two met, the ex-wife directly warned Lan and I not to even think about giving her son permanent residency, because Jiho's current assets all belonged to her two daughters. Lan and I nervously clenched her hands after hearing this, but she quickly adjusted her mentality, and said that she would not bother her husband about such matters in the future, and that she would just call her if there were any problems with the child in the future. Just then, Jiho called. Lan and I pretended to be very happy, and then took out her husband's bank card to show off in front of her ex-wife. After returning home, Lan and I leaned against the door to relieve her inner tension, and her ex-wife was also bullied so dismally for the first time. In the following days, she woke up every midnight asking about her daughter's situation, and tried every means to cause trouble for Lan and I. But Lan and I always responded with silence, and she was so frustrated that she vented her anger at home. After learning the situation, the mother went to meet Jiho alone, and told him about the two wives meeting in private, and pretended to kindly remind him that Lan and I is a crafty woman. At the same time, the eldest daughter, who had just returned home from school, brought snacks for her younger sister. Tom, who was standing nearby, also really wanted to eat it. The two children fought again. After hearing her younger sister's cries, the eldest daughter directly scolded Tom. Lan and I, who had returned home, happened to see the scene. However, this time, she did not let her son endure bullying as she usually did. Instead, she directly criticized her sister for what she had done. Lan and I's lecture also happened to be heard by Jiho, who had returned home. The two daughters also directly went to their father to cry about it. Soon Jiho called Lan and I over for a private chat. However, before he could say anything, Lan and I took the lead and expressed her thoughts. She said that she would definitely treat the children equally in the future, and that she would be responsible for the children's interactions with their ex-wife in the future. Afterwards, Lan and I picked up her glass of red wine and gulped it down. Jiho was also very surprised by his wife's change. That night, his ex-wife called Lan and I, and asked her to bring her daughter over after school. The next day when Lan and I took her two daughters to her ex-wife's house, she found her ex-wife barefoot, and the sound of another man's voice coming from inside the house. After returning home, Lan and I told her husband directly about what had happened. After hearing this, her husband went directly to her ex-wife's house to pick up the children. After the two met, they had a big fight. Jiho forbade his ex-wife from seeing the children again. That day, Lan and I prepared the ingredients and wanted her husband to go with her to her son's outing. However, her husband refused directly, saying that he had a meeting at the company. Lan and I was a little disappointed, but still nodded with a smile. What she didn't expect was that her husband took his ex-wife and children on the outing. The four of them were laughing and talking. The scene was very cheerful. Tom was envious of the other children who had their fathers with them. He really hoped that his father could come with him once. Lan and I could only explain that her father had to go to work. After the event was over, Lan and I was preparing to go home with her son on her back. Unexpectedly, She met her husband and the family of 4 on the way back. It turned out that her husband had lied about going to the office and had actually